One of the most powerful countries of our time is the People's Republic of China. China has the second largest economy after the US, measured by normal GDP and the largest when measured by purchasing power. It is the world's factory, producing everything from electronics to clothing, and it dominates global trade. China holds huge amounts of foreign reserves, and it is a major lender to other countries through projects like the Belt and Road Initiative. With over 1.4 billion people, China has the largest population on Earth. This provides a fast labor force and a huge consumer market, both of which fuel its economy and political influence. China is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, giving it a veto power over global decisions. It is active in shaping international organizations and alliances, especially in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. But China wasn't always a superpower. To understand how China got here, we must look at its bloody history and the people who have shaped China. Just a century ago, there was the Qing dynasty, which had ruled since the 1600s, but it was on the gradual decline after losing wars to Britain, France, and Japan. In the 1800s, this was called the Age of Humiliation. By the early 1900s, foreign powers controlled trade, ports, and territory through spheres of influence. Ordinary Chinese felt exploited and humiliated. It collapsed after internal corruption, rebellions, and foreign invasions. By 1911, the Qing dynasty collapsed. With it, more than 2,000 years of emperors and dynasties came to an end. What followed was not stability, but chaos. A fragile republic replaced the throne, but warlords, corruption, and foreign powers tore the country apart. Out of the power vacuum, new ideas began to spread, such as nationalism, socialism, and communism. And from the ruins of the empire, leaders like Mao Zedong would rise to reshape China's destiny. Mao Zedong was born on December 26, 1893, in Shaoshan, a rural village in Hunan province, central China. His father was Mao Zedong, a peasant farmer who had worked hard to build wealth after coming from poverty. He was strict, tough, and often harsh with Mao, pushing him toward farm work and discipline. But Mao disliked farm labor and preferred reading, stories, and exploring ideas. His mother, Wen Qimei, a gentle, devout Buddhist, she was more caring and had a strong influence on Mao's early character, especially his sense of compassion. When Mao was old enough, he attended local schools where he studied Confucius classics, Chinese history, and philosophy. Unlike many rural children, he was given the chance to read widely, including works on reform, revolution, and Western thought. He became fascinated with heroes, rebels, and military leaders in Chinese history. Mao grew up in a modest farming family. While his father tried to instill discipline through him with hard farm work, Mao's own passion for learning and questioning authority pushed him towards books, politics, and revolution. The turmoil of China in the early 1900s gave him the perfect environment to dream of a new kind of China. As a teenager, Mao began questioning traditional authority. He resisted his father's attempts to control him and later opposed the older imperial order itself. He admired figures who challenged power and believed China needed change. An important year in Mao's life was in 1911. When Mao was 17, the Xinei Revolution overthrew the Qing dynasty. This inspired him. He cut off a queue, a traditional branding symbolizing loyalty to the Qing, and embraced modern reform. As a student in Changsha, the province capital of Hunan, Mao read widely Chinese classics, Western philosophy, and radical political writing. He admired Sun Yat-sen's nationalism at first, but was still exploring other ideas. In 1919, after World War I, Chinese students protested against foreign powers controlling China. This was called the May 4th movement. Mao was deeply influenced. He became convinced China needed total social and cultural transformation, not just minor reforms. At the time, Mao was in Shaanxi, Hunan province, not Beijing, where the main protests began. He was working as a teacher, writer, and activist, and he was already deeply engaged with student politics. His activities included helping organize students' protests in Shaanxi in support of the national-wide May 4th demonstrations. He co-founded the New People Studies Society, a group of young intellectuals dedicated to exploring new political and social ideas. He wrote articles for newspapers urging the rejection of old traditions and embracing modern radical change. The movement radicalized him. Before this, he had admired Sun Yat-sen's nationalism. After May 4th, Mao became convinced that cultural revolution was just as important as political one. This set him on a path towards Marxism, which he had fully embraced in the following years. Another reason why Mao was against traditional values was because traditional China was built on Confucius values, such as obedience to authority, loyalty to family, and rigid social hierarchies. Mao disliked this because he had a strict, authoritarian father who embraced these values, which made him associate tradition with oppression. He believed hierarchy held people back and kept peasants poor and powerless. Mao felt that traditional thinking had failed China's dynasties, emperors, and Confucius scholars, who had not been able to stop foreign powers from humiliating and exploiting the country. For him, tradition was linked with China's weakness and decline. After the May 4th movement in 1919, Mao's life began to accelerate. This was the period when he shifted from being a local activist to a committed revolutionary. The May 4th movement convinced him that China's problems weren't just political, but social and cultural. He felt energized to find a real solution. He was impatient with Confucian traditions, the weakness of the republic, and the dominance of foreign powers. Mao stayed in Shanghai, teaching schools and writing political articles. He helped create workers and student groups pushing for radical social reform. He also co-founded the New People's Study Society, which grew an important network of future revolutionaries. Mao began reading Marxist works and was influenced by discussions with intellects connected to Peking University. In 1920, he started organizing workers' strikes in Shanghai. Seeing the power of movements in the masses, in July 1921, Mao attended the First Congress of Chinese Communist Party, later CCP. In Shanghai, as a representative for Hunan, this was the first real steps into the national political stage. Discovering Marxism gave Mao a clear framework. He felt he had finally found the answer to how to rebuild China. After the CCP was formed, Mao focused on building support in his home province of Hunan. He organized labor strikes in factories and wrote pamphlets about peasants' rights. Mao believed that unlike in Europe, where Marx focused on industrial workers, China's revolution had to come from the peasants, who made up the majority of the population. The CCP aligned with the Nationalist Party, Kuomintang, or KMT, led by Sun Yat-sen, to fight warlords and reunify China. Mao worked within this alliance, helping to spread revolutionary ideas in rural areas. But after Sun Yat-sen's death in 1925, Chiang Kai-shek took control of the KMT, and he was hostile to the communists. In 1927, Chiang Kai-shek launched a violent purge of communists in Shanghai and other cities. Thousands were killed, but Mao survived. But this forced the communists into hiding. It was here that Mao concluded that revolution must rely on peasants and guerrilla warfare, not urban uprising. When Chiang Kai-shek's forces massacred communists, the CCP was almost destroyed. Mao retreated to the countryside with only a few hundred followers who survived. The small group became the core of his guerrilla army. Mao and other communists spread to the countryside, especially Jiangxi province, where they set up a Soviet base of communist control. Mao developed his strategies of guerrilla warfare and peasant-based revolution. This period hardened his belief that the countryside, not the cities, would be the heart of China's revolution. In September 1927, Mao led the autumn harvest uprisings in Hunan, aiming to rally peasants against landlords. The revolt was crushed and Mao's forces were decimated. Instead of giving up, Mao retreated with survivors to the Yungan Mountains on the Hunan-Yangtze border. There he began developing his theory of guerrilla warfare, using mobility, surprise, and peasant support to outlast stronger enemies. Mao and Zhu Di, a talented military commander, joined forces in the mountains, forming the Red Army. Together they built the Soviet Jiangxi, the largest communist-controlled area in China at that time. Mao experimented with land reforms, redistribution land from landlords to peasants, which won him massive support. He also began shaping the CCP's military philosophy. Quote, "The people are like water and the army is like fish," end quote, meaning the Red Army had to live among support and would be supported by the peasants. However, Mao faced opposition inside his own party. Soviet advisors and rivals like CCP leaders accused him of being too peasant-focused. At times, Mao was even sidelined. Despite this, his strategy kept the Red Army alive while the KMT launched multiple campaigns to crush them. One might be thinking at this time, why would anyone join Mao and leave their homes and put themselves in danger? The answer lies in a mix of desperation and hope. Most Chinese peasants lived in extreme poverty. They worked long hours on land owned by wealthy landlords, paying high rents and taxes while keeping little for themselves. Famines, floods, and constant warlord battles made life insecure. So when Mao promised land, reform, and justice, peasants had everything to gain. So they thought. Reality was going to be very different for these people once they realized what Mao was really planning. In Shaanxi Soviet, Mao and the CCP stole land from landlords and gave it to poor peasants. Landlords were sometimes put on people's trials, and peasants who had suffered for generations suddenly saw the powerful punished. For many peasants, this was the first time anyone had fought for their interest. Unlike warlords or KMT armies, which often looted villages, Mao enforced strict rules for these soldiers. Don't take from the people, pay fairly for food, treat peasants with respect. This won trust among villagers who saw the Red Army not as predators but as protectors. This was because Mao needed more people and was not in the position of power. He needed to be liked. This would later change once he was in power. Chiang Kai-shek launched 5 major campaigns to wipe out the communists in Shaanxi. These became the defining battles of Mao's early military career. The first encirclement, which was in 1930, the nationalist plan was Chiang Kai-shek sent over 100,000 troops to crush the communists. Mao and Zhu Di used guerrilla tactics, avoiding head-on battles, luring nationalist troops deep into unfamiliar territory, then ambushing them. The result was the Red Army, with only about 30,000 troops, managed to defeat and rout the larger KMT force. With each win, they gained weapons and supplies. This strengthened Mao's belief in mobile and flexible warfare. The second encirclement campaign began a year later, in 1931, when Chiang Kai-shek attacked again, this time with around 200,000 soldiers. Mao's Red Army used the same lure and strike strategy, retreating when pressed and then striking suddenly when the enemy was tired and overstretched. The communists again won, inflicting heavy losses on the KMT. Launched later in 1931 with a larger force, by now the Red Army had improved in size and organization. Mao again relied on guerrilla tactics, surprise attacks, and the knowledge of the terrain, forcing the nationalists to retreat. The impact of these victories boosted the Red Army's morale and attracted more peasants to their cause. Once again, there was another fourth encirclement, which was in 1933, when Chiang Kai-shek, determined to end the communists, sent nearly 500,000 troops. However, Mao had been temporarily pushed aside in the CCP's leadership by pro-Soviet rivals who favored a conventional warfare instead of guerrilla tactics. Without Mao's flexible strategy, the Red Army suffered heavy losses, though they were not completely destroyed. The fifth encirclement campaign happened in 1934, when Chiang Kai-shek launched his largest effort using a strategy of blockhouses, which meant fortified positions to slowly encircle and strangle the Shaanxi Soviets. The communists, following Soviet advisors instead of Mao's methods, tried to fight in a fixed conventional battle, which played into Chiang Kai-shek's hands. By 1934, the Red Army was badly weakened with huge casualties and a loss of territory. The impact, the CCP had no choice but to abandon the province, leading to the Long March. These battles taught Mao the lessons that defined his military thought. For one, fight only when victory is certain, retreat when necessary, live among the peasants, and strike when the enemy least expects it. The failure of the later campaigns, when his strategy was abandoned, set the stage for his dramatic comeback during the Long March. By late 1934, the Red Army was nearly surrounded by Chiang Kai-shek's blockhouses, with no way to hold the province. The CCP decided to break out and march west and north to find a safer base, and around 86,000 men and women began the retreat, carrying what supplies they could. It was not one long continuous march, but a series of epic retreats and battles across China. Over the course of a year, the Red Army traveled around 9,000 kilometers, or 6,000 miles, across mountains, swamps, rivers, and hostile territory. They faced constant pursuit by nationalist forces, hunger, disease, and brutal terrain. Early in the Long March, the Red Army suffered devastating losses. From 86,000, only about 30,000 remained. At the town of Zuni in Shaanxi province, CCPT leaders had a crucial meeting. The contents of this meeting consisted of the Red Army had been suffering heavy losses during the early phases of the Long March, especially after battles against nationalist forces. The CCP needed to reassess its military strategy and leadership. Leaders criticized the military tactics of Bo Gi and Otto Braun, who had been followed rigid Comintern strategies. These strategies emphasized conventional positional warfare, which led to repeated defeats. The conference decided to abandon those rigid tactics in favor of a more flexible guerrilla-style strategies adapted to China's conditions. Mao Zedong was elevated to a central role in the military leadership. The Zhuyi Conference is considered a turning point for the Communist Party. It ensured that future strategies were based on China's realities rather than strictly following Soviet/Comintern direction. It laid the foundation for Mao's eventual dominance in the party. He began to exert greater influence over the Red Army and the CCP. This marked the start of Mao's rise as the undisputed leader of the CCP. Mao Zedong emerged as a top strategist and leader. His guerrilla tactics were finally recognized as the only way forward. Some of the key moments that happened along the march was the crossing of the Luding Bridge in May 1935. The bridge was about 100 meters long, over the rushing, dangerous Dadu River. It structured 13 thick iron chains anchored on each side, with planks laid across to form a walkway. By the time the Red Army arrived, defenders had removed many of the wooden planks, leaving only the bare chains across the roaring river. The Red Army soldiers, under heavy fire, clambered across a chain bridge to secure a vital crossing. Nationalist-aligned warlords troops guarded the opposite end of the bridge. They set up machine guns and rifle, raining fire upon anyone who dared attempt the crossing. A special unit of 22 volunteers, sometimes reported as more, were selected to lead the crossing. Under intense fire, these men clambered across the bridge on their hands and knees along the chains, with the rushing river below and bullets flying overhead. Some carried boards to lay down as they advanced, gradually recreating a path for the others to cross. The Red Army troops on the near bank laid down suppressive fire to cover the assault team. Another unit wandered or swam downstream, attempting to flank the defenders. Once the assault team broke through, more troops rushed across, securing the bridge. This event was later mythologized and over-dramatized with heroic exaggeration, portraying a do-or-die moment that decided the survival of the communist movement. While there is no doubt that a battle for the bridge occurred, historians debate how fierce the fighting actually was. Some argue that the nationalist resistance may have been weaker than later accounts claim, and that the CCP amplified the drama to build revolutionary legends. Another one of these events happened in 1935, when the communist forces were located in the snowy mountains. These were the high ranges of the eastern Tibetan Plateau, with peaks well above 4,000 and 5,000 meters. Soldiers faced thin air, intense cold, blizzards, and avalanches. Many lacked warm clothing or shoes, so frostbite was common. At night, temperatures dropped far below freezing. Soldiers often huddled together just to survive till morning. Supplies were almost gone by the stage of the long march. Soldiers survived on wild plants, roots, tree bark, and even boiled leather. Eyewitnesses' accounts recall soldiers cooking grass in helmets or cutting off strips of raw animal hide to chew for energy. Some went days without eating. Starvation deaths were common. Many soldiers had worn out their old shoes, and after thousands of kilometers, they bound their feet with rags or walked barefoot over ice and stone. Frostbite led to amputations, and countless men were left behind. Malaria, dysentery, and infections spread in the swampy grasslands. Soldiers who had the unfortunate fate who fell ill or collapsed were rarely able to continue. Many of them were left to die. Survivors would later recall that entire columns would vanish into the bogs or be swallowed by the swamps. But to Mao, the ends justified the means. But you might be asking, how was Mao doing during this time? Well, he was already in a poor health when the Long March began in 1934. He suffered from recurring tuberculosis, malaria, and intestinal problems, which left him weak and feverish. Because of this, he couldn't always walk on foot like ordinary soldiers. At times, he was placed on a stretcher carried by soldiers or rode a horse when available. CCP propaganda after 1949 often downplayed Mao's illnesses and stretcher carrying, instead highlighting him as a resilient revolutionary sharing the soldiers' hardship. Later CCP narratives emphasized that Mao endured the same trials as the soldiers to build his image as a great helmsman who suffered alongside with his people, which was not completely true, but this helped the image along with the peasant population. But the time finally came when Mao and his forces finally reached their destination, Hunan, in a remote mountainous region in Shaanxi province. Out of 80,000 who began the Long March in 1934, only about 7,000 to 8,000 survived by 1935. That means over 90% of those who began the march did not make it to the end. But once they reached Hunan, it offered them safety from nationalist encirclement and a place to regroup. For Mao, it was more than a military refuge, it was the perfect stage to rebuild the communist movement. But in 1937, something happened that would cause the communists and nationalists to unite, which was the invasion of Japan. Japan was a growing industrial power but lacked natural resources like coal, iron, and especially oil, which they needed. China, particularly Manchuria, had rich deposits of coal, iron, and fertile farmland. Expansion was seen as necessary to secure a self-sufficient empire. The Japanese military, especially the army, believed that conquering China was essential to defend Japan from Western powers and the Soviet Union. Controlling China would give Japan strategic depth and influence over Asia. After the fall of the Qing dynasty, China was fragmented with warlords competing for power. The nationalist government was still consolidating authority, making China appear vulnerable. Japan saw this as an opportunity to expand with relative little undefined resistance. Japan's leader promoted an idea of building a greater East Asian sphere, where Japan could lead Asia and push out Western influence. Many in Japan believed it was their destiny to dominate China in Asia. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. Cities like Beijing and Shanghai and Nanking fell, facing a common enemy. The communist CCP and nationalist KMT agreed to form the Second United Front. In reality, cooperation was tense. The nationalist forces bore the brunt of the conventional fighting, while the communists focused on guerrilla warfare behind Japanese lines. Expanding their influence in rural areas, Mao used Hunan to consolidate his control over the party and army. The Red Army became the 8th Root Army and the new 4th Army, nominally under nationalist command but still loyal to the CCP. He emphasized self-reliance. Soldiers and peasants grew their own food, built their own home, and shared hardships. Hunan became a symbol of discipline, simplicity, and revolutionary purity, especially compared to the corruption of Chiang Kai-shek. Mao feared that foreign ideologies, especially rigid Soviet Marxist-Leninism taught by Moscow-trained leaders, would weaken his authority. During the early 1940s, while China was still fighting Japan, Mao launched his first major ideological campaign inside the CCP. Soviet orthodoxy and Comintern advisors had long influenced CCP strategy. Mao wanted to adopt Marxism-Leninism to Chinese conditions, rejecting mechanical copying of the Soviet model. Mao used the campaign to unify the party around himself, eliminating rivals and dissenters. It shifted the CCP from a collective leadership to one dominated by Mao personally. This was done different methods. For example, party members were required to read Marx, Lenin, and especially Mao's writing. Groups of discussion reinforced the idea that Mao's interpretation was superior. Members confessed their mistakes, ideological weaknesses, and lack of loyalty. These confessions were often written, read aloud, and criticized by peers. The campaign was launched while China was still fighting Japan, giving Mao time to reshape the party internally. Intensive re-education aimed to reshape not only actions but also inner beliefs. Intellectuals, in particular, were targeted to abandon bourgeoisie or foreign ways of thinking. Some key rivals were Wang Mi, Bu Gu, and other Moscow-trained leaders. They lost influence. By 1945, as the war against Japan started to turn in their favor, Mao had built up his cult-like circle and was the undisputed ideological and political leader of the CCP. The party formally adopted Mao Zedong thought as its guiding ideology as the Seventh Party Congress. The campaign created a culture of obedience, conformity, and fear of dissonance. Without the invasion of Japan, Mao might have lost the war, because the majority of the nationalists were doing all the heavy fighting, and while Mao and his forces were building up support among people living in rural areas. This also gave Mao some time to think of strategy without constant attacks from the KMT. But once Japan had surrendered in 1945, the war between the communists and nationalists were back on. In 1946, open fighting broke out. At first, the nationalists had the advantages. They controlled major cities, railways, and the majority of the army. They were supported by the U.S. with weapons and aid. But the communists had key advantages, which were popular support in rural areas, superior guerrilla tactics that were honed during the Japanese War, and motivated troops, compared to the often demoralized and corrupt KMT forces. In 1947, Mao and his generals, especially Lin Biao, shifted from guerrilla warfare to large-scale conventional battles. By 1947, the CCP went on the offensive, gradually capturing territory in Manchuria and northern China. The nationalists, meanwhile, were collapsing internally. Rampant corruption with Chiang Kai-shek's government, hyperinflation that destroyed the economy and made urban populations furious. Soldiers deserting or defecting to the communists were common. There were also three major campaigns that sealed the KMT's fate, one of them being the Lao Shin campaign. It was fought in Manchuria, northeast China, from September to November in 1948, and it decisively shifted the balance of power toward Mao and the communists. To give some context, Manchuria was rich in coal, iron, and heavy industry. Whoever controlled Manchuria controlled a vast economic and military base. After Japan's surrender, both the CCP and KMT rushed to seize Manchuria. The Soviets temporarily occupied it. This allowed the CCP to take many weapons. The KMT, with U.S. transport help, also moved large amounts of troops into the region. By 1948, both sides were dug in. The KMT under Chiang Kai-shek held the main cities, while the communists controlled the countryside. Both armies had big numbers, but the KMT forces were outnumbered. The communist forces had about 700,000 troops, commanded by Lin Biao. Nationalist KMT forces had about 550,000 troops under Wing Ling. Though scattered and relying heavily on holding cities, Lin Biao knew the nationalist armies in Manchuria could only be reinforced through Jingzhou, a strategic city linking Manchuria to North China. The communists laid siege to Jingzhou, and Chiang Kai-shek ordered reinforcements from Xinjiang to relieve it. But they were stopped at Taxin after brutal fighting. On October 15, 1948, Jingzhou fell, isolating all KMT forces in Manchuria. The communists had already surrounded Shangchun for months, starving the city. Conditions were horrific. Unfortunately, tens of thousands of civilians died of hunger. And on October 19, 1948, the nationalist garrison surrendered without a major battle. After losing these important cities, the remaining KMT forces retreated to Xinjiang. On November 2, 1948, the city fell after the defenders lost morale and surrendered. The results of the battle were around 470,000 troops, which were the KMT losses, which were either killed, captured, or defected. Nearly the entire nationalist presence in Manchuria was destroyed. The communist victory gained huge stockpiles of supplies, artillery, and tanks left by the nationalists. The victory gave the CCP full control of Manchuria, providing them a powerful industrial and resourceful base. With Manchuria secure, the communists could now send reinforcements south for the next big battle. The Weihai Campaign was the largest and most decisive battle of the Chinese Civil War. It ran from November 6, 1948 to January 10, 1949, and was fought in the central plains of eastern China. After losing Manchuria in the Luoyang Campaign, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists still had strong forces in central and eastern China. The region had the Hu River and the Zhuxi city, which was strategically vital. It was the gateway to Nanking, the nationalist capital. Both sides massed huge forces for what became the largest campaign of the war. The communists had about 600,000 troops, commanded by Liu Bixing and Di Zhengping and Su Yu, coordinating multiple field armies, supported by millions of peasants who carried supplies, built roads, and transported artillery by hand carts. The nationalist KMT forces had about 800,000, under Chiang Kai-shek's overall direction, with frontline generals such as Liu Zi, Du Ying, and Hong Batu, heavily equipped thanks to the U.S. This battle unfolded in three major phases. First was the encirclement of Hongshu Beitao's army. The communists quickly moved to cut off Honggang Beitao's 100,000-strong 7th Army near Shandongzhou. The communists surrounded the force, cutting supply and escape routes. Despite airlifts and attempts at relief, Hongyang's troops collapsed after fierce fighting. By November 22nd, the entire 7th Army was destroyed. Hunan committed suicide. Chiang Kai-shek sent the 12th Army, which was about 120,000 troops south, to break the siege. The communists ambushed them near Shangjizi, encircling the force over weeks of brutal fighting. Huiyang's troops ran out of supplies, and by early December, most of the 12th Army had surrendered. Huiyanghui was captured, with two major armies lost. Chiang Kai-shek ordered a general withdrawal from the province, but there was even more bad news. Du Yingming's 200,000 men tried to retreat west, but they were intercepted and suffered heavy losses. In late December, the PLA encircled Du's forces at Yongqing. After bloody fighting and starvation, Du surrendered on January 10, 1949. The results from this battle were nationalist losses around 600,000 troops, either destroyed, killed, or captured. Communist losses were heavy but far fewer, estimated around 100,000 to 200,000 casualties. The KMT lost nearly all of its best armies in east-central China. The nationalist forces lost their main force in central China. In the aftermath, the PLA gained huge amounts of captured equipment, including artillery, tanks, and American-made weapons. Most soldiers during this time could see the writing on the wall, because the KMT were gradually losing more and more ground to the communists. Then came the last major battle, which was Pingqing Campaign. The North China nationalist forces under Fu Ziyi still controlled Beijing, Tianjin, and Zhangjiakou. These cities were strategically vital. Controlling them meant controlling access between Manchuria, Inner Mongolia, and northern China. Chiang Kai-shek ordered Fu Zi to hold northern China at all costs, but morale and discipline were weakening after repeated defeats. The communists had about 890,000 troops from North China Field Army, and they were well supplied after recent victories with strong artillery and pleasant logistics support. The nationalist forces, based in Beijing, which held strong defensive positions, which meant they were cut off from reinforcements. The PLA struck west, and they hit a key railway junction. Fu Zi sent 2 corps to reinforce it, but the PLA intercepted them near Xingbaoan, inflicting heavy casualties. By December 22, 1948, the city had fell, cutting off Fu Zi from reinforcement into Inner Mongolia. The PLA encircled Tianjin, a major port and industrial city. It was defended by 130,000 nationalist troops. After 34 days of siege, the PLA launched a full-scale assault on January 14th. In just 29 hours, Tianjin fell in brutal street fighting. Nearly all defenders were killed or captured. The fall of Tianjin eliminated Fu Zi's eastern flank and left Beijing exposed. At this time, the end of the nationalist forces was inevitable. With Tianjin lost and supply lines gone, Fu Zi faced defeat. The PLA forces began surrounding Beijing, preparing for a massive assault. However, to preserve the ancient capital and its cultural heritage like the Forbidden City, temples, and the communists pursued negotiations. On January 22nd, Fu Zi agreed to surrendering Beijing without a fight, and a couple of days later, on January 31st, the PLA marched peacefully into the city. This would become known as the Peaceful Liberation of Beijing. The casualties of this battle were nationalist losses around 520,000 troops neutralized, which meant killed, captured, or surrendered. The loss of Beijing and Tianjin meant total collapse of nationalist power in North China. The communist gained control to all of northern China, including the 2 great northern cities, a massive boost in morale and legitimacy. The peaceful surrender of Beijing preserved its cultural treasures, helping Mao present the CCP as a patriotic protector of China's cultural heritage, which in reality he didn't care about. Fu Zi and many officers later cooperated with the new regime, boasting CCP's political base. With the 3 great campaigns complete, the nationalists had lost 1.5 million of their best troops. Within months, the communists crossed the Yangtze and captured Nanking and Shanghai, leading to the proclamation of the PRC in October 1949. Chiang Kai-shek and the remnants of the nationalist government fled to the island of Taiwan, where they established the Republic of China, which even still today they have many issues between each other and might go to war in the foreseeable future. On October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong stayed in Tiananmen Square in Beijing and declared the founding of the People's Republic of China. For Mao, this was the fulfillment of decades of struggle, from a poor farmer's son in Hunan to a revolutionary fugitive to the leader of the world's most populous nation. Mao believed this was the only beginning. China would now be built under his vision of socialism. For China, it marked the end of a century of humiliation, foreign invasions, and civil wars, and the beginning of a new communist era. The total death count for the Civil War is unknown, but many historians place it around 5 to 8 million deaths, which include both military and civilian. Many people in China thought after all this death there would finally be peace, and they could live happily ever after. But unfortunately for these people, it was only the beginning of something far worse. From this point on, Mao would be in power. Mao would become chairman of the People's Republic of China. The CCP quickly moved to eliminate oppositions, just like Stalin did. But Mao had nationalist sympathizers, landlords, and former elites purged. The people's courts tried and executed thousands accused of being enemies of the revolution. This could be anyone Mao didn't like or was suspicious of. Land was confiscated from landlords who had worked on the land they owned, but it was stolen from them and given to peasants. While it gained peasant support, it was often violent, and many landlords were killed in public struggles. After these, there was another war, which would happen in Korea when North Korea invaded South. Mao sent the Chinese People's Volunteer Army to aid the North. This was hugely costly, but it established China as a major power willing to confront the U.S. It also strengthened Mao's authority at home, presenting him as a defender of the revolution against Western imperialism. With Soviet aid, Mao pushed rapid industrialization, focusing on steel, coal, railways, and heavy industry. Cities grew, but the countryside still carried the burden of feeding China. And in 1956, Mao briefly allowed intellectuals to criticize the CCP under the slogan, quote, "Let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend," end quote. This was, of course, a trap. Many intellectuals openly criticized corruption and bureaucracy in Mao's leadership. Mao quickly reversed the course and launched the anti-rightist campaign in 1957. Hundreds of thousands of critics were labeled rightist and purged from jobs or imprisoned, or also sent to labor camps. This showed Mao's intolerance for dissent and cemented fear as a tool of control. By the mid-1950s, Mao believed the Soviet-style model of development was too slow. He dreamed of transforming China into a world power overnight, surpassing even Britain in steel production. His answer to this was the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward was a radical campaign of mass mobilization, cultivation of agriculture, and backyard steel production. To start, Mao was filled with confidence and ambition, convinced that the masses' revolutionary spirit could achieve anything. But by the late 1950s, Mao wanted to surpass the West and the Soviet Union in both agriculture and industry. He believed that with the mass mobilization of China's 600 million people, the country could leap into communism almost overnight. Mao's idea was that political will and revolutionary enthusiasm could overcome material limits like technology or resources. Private farming was abolished. Villages were merged into massive people's communes, each with tens of thousands of people. Communes controlled all land, tools, and labor. Families even ate together in communal kitchens. The state took crops directly from communes to feed cities and export abroad. So the people who were working the farms basically owned nothing and were at the whims of Mao and his government. This would end up coming back to kill them, literally. Mao wanted China to catch up to Britain in steel production within 15 years. Millions of peasants were ordered to build backyard furnaces and smelt down scrap metal, even cooking pots and farming tools. Most of the steel produced was useless, brittle slag. Armories were forced into huge irrigation workers in construction projects. They were poorly planned and exhausting, and often deadly because the peasants who were working in these environments often lacked proper equipment to carry out the tasks that were needed. But what happened on the ground was very different than what Mao was envisioning. The reality on the ground was that local officials were afraid of displeasing Mao, exaggerating production figures. If a commune produced 10 tons of grain, they might report 20. The state then requisitioned food based on inflated numbers, leaving peasants with nothing. Peasants were pushed to work long hours in fields and furnaces, neglecting farm work. The obsession with steel and large projects diverted labor away from growing food. Then in 1959, something even worse happened, which was a famine. The crops failed due to bad weather and poor farming methods and labor shortages. But because of the inflated reports, the state continued to seize grain for cities and exports, while villages starved. The result was the worst famine in human history. Between 20 to 45 million people died from starvation, overwork, and disease. In some areas, families resorted to eating tree bark, mud, and in extreme cases, even cannibalism. There are even some quotes from eyewitnesses of this terrible event. Quote, "We ate tree bark, leaves, and even cotton seed husks. People boiled leather shoes, and in the end, people starved to death on the roads," end quote, which was a survivor from Hunan province, quoted on his tombstone. Another quote from this era says, quote, "The famine was so terrible that villagers dug up the dead to eat. In some places, parents exchanged their children so they wouldn't have to eat their own," end quote. This came from a local report from another province in the countryside. So you might be asking, what was Mao's response to all this suffering of his own people? Some province leaders, like Pian Dun, tried to warn Mao that people were starving. At the Lushan conference in 1959, Ping wrote a letter criticizing the leap and reporting the famine. Mao denounced him as a rightist and purged him. Mao insisted the famine was due to sabotage, bad weather, or hidden grain, not policy mistakes. By 1960, entire provinces were collapsing, grain exports quickly reduced, and some emergency food was allowed. He began stepping back from day-to-day economic management. Leaders like Liu Shiqi, Zhu Enlai, and Deng Xiaoping took control of the relief measures. In 1961, Mao admitted at the party meeting that, quote, "the chaos was 30% natural disaster and 70% man-made," end quote. By 1962, famine conditions eased as collectivization was loosened and grain imports were brought in. 30 to 45 million deaths had occurred, the largest famine in human history. Mao never fully admitted fault. Instead, he shifted blame onto local officials, natural disasters, or rightists. Internally, some leaders like Liu Shiqi often called it a man-made disaster. This later fueled Mao's anger against Liu and Deng during the Cultural Revolution. After the famine, Mao's prestige was damaged. Other leaders like Liu Shiqi and Deng Xiaoping took control of restoring the economy. They reversed many Great Leap policies, like farmers were allowed to farm small private plots again, communes were relaxed, and industrial focused more on practical growth than on political slogans. This brought some recovery. The agricultural output increased, living conditions stabilized, but for Mao this was humiliating. His vision of a rapid revolution was being sidelined. Mao saw Liu Shiqi and Deng Xiaoping reformed as a betrayal of socialism, a slide back towards capitalism. The Sino-Soviet split early in the 1960s when China broke away from the Soviet Union, accusing Moscow of being a revisionist and abandoning true Marxism. Mao began to believe China was the last defender of global revolution, and he personally had to guard against betrayal inside the CCP. He was like Stalin, becoming increasingly more and more paranoid because he had created so many enemies throughout the years. Mao launched a campaign to, quote, re-educate the peasant class in socialist values. It aimed to purge corruption, bureaucracy, and capitalistic tendencies, but it didn't restore his lost authority. Mao grew increasingly frustrated and convinced that the party itself had become infected with capitalist roaders. Mao began laying the groundwork for a massive political strike against his rivals. He built alliances with radical supporters like his wife, Xing Qing, and Defense Minister Lin Bao. He turned to China's youth, believing they were more revolutionary and less corrupted by bureaucracy. In secret, Mao's plan that would become the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution began. But during this time in the 60s, Mao's health started to give way. He had recurring heart and circulation issues, and by this period he may have experienced mild strokes, though they were not yet debilitating. By the mid-60s, Mao felt marginalized within his own party. Leaders like Liu Shiqi and Deng Xiaoping had more practical authority. He feared the CCP was drifting towards capitalism like the Soviet Union. Mao wanted to reassert his supremacy in the party, purge his rivals, and rekindle revolutionary zeal among the masses, especially in the youth. To ensure his personal ideology, Mao Zedong thought he would dominate China. Mao began by targeting intellectuals in cultural spheres, like schools and universities. They were told to focus on politics rather than academics. Students formed militant groups called Red Guards who worshipped Mao and carried the, quote, little red book of his quotations. Mao encouraged them to bombard the headquarters, meaning attack authority figures like teachers, officials, and even CCP leaders. Red Guards rampaged across China. Teachers, intellectuals, and perceived capitalists were humiliated, beaten, or killed. Temples, historical relics, and cultural treasures were destroyed as symbols of the old society. Families were torn apart as children denounced their parents. Mao used this chaos to purge rivals like Liu Xingqing, who was accused of being a traitor and a capitalist. He was beaten, imprisoned, and died in disgrace in 1969. Deng Xiaoping was purged and sent to perform hard labor. China's descended into near anarchy. Factories shut down, schools closed, and rival Red Guard factions fought each other. The army under Lin Biao was called in to restore order. Mao elevated Lin as his designated successor. But in 1971, Lin fell from favor and died in a mysterious plane crash, while allegedly fleeing after a failed coup attempt. This shook Mao deeply and revealed the instability within his inner circle, and by the early 70s, the worst Red Guard chaos subsided. The CCP gradually rebuilt order, but Mao still kept rivals in check through political campaigns. Internationally, Mao made a dramatic move. In 1972, the U.S. President Richard Nixon visited China, marking a thaw in relations and giving Mao global prestige. Despite this, Mao's health began to decline and factional struggles inside the CCP grew intense. Mao continued to rule, but he was increasingly frail and isolated. His wife, Yang Qing, and her allies, later known as the Gang of Four, gained influence, pushing radical cultural revolution policies. Moderates like Zhu Enlai and the rehabilitated Deng Xiaoping tried to stabilize the country. When Zhu died in 1976, millions mourned him, a sign that the public was weary of Mao's chaos. Mao himself died a couple months later on September 9, 1976, aged 82, leaving a mixed legacy of revolution success and catastrophic destruction. He industrialized China, but at what cost? During the Cultural Revolution, between 1 and 2 million people died, and even more were persecuted, imprisoned, or exiled. But moreover, the effects of China's ancient and historical past were destroyed because of communism. Folk tradition and festivals were seen as wasteful or backward. And during the Cultural Revolution, Red Guards were mobilized to destroy old ideas, culture, customs, and habits. And temples, Confucian sites, and Buddhist statues and ancient books were burned or smashed. Traditional art, opera, and literature were banned or replaced with propaganda. Reverence for family, ancestors, and elders, a central part of Confucius culture, was denounced as counter-revolutionary. At the end of his life, Chairman Mao Zedong was responsible for 40 to 50 million deaths, a truly sad and devastating period for the Chinese. Let me know what you think in the comments about this era, and if you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more in the future.